Good morning. I'm Hemant, and I'm here from Dell Technologies. With me, I have Dhruval, who's from NVIDIA, and then we have one more co-speaker who couldn't be here, which is Rahul. So he's from Robinhood. And we are here to talk about how you could fortify AIOPs. And then what we are trying to do is try to have a mashup of a lot of open source, free-to-use utilities put together so that you could actually ensure that you are fortifying AIOPs at the least possible cost and then doing it the most efficient way. So we'll talk about CSAF, which is Common Security Advisory Framework, and then we'll talk about VEX, which is Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange as well, how they come together to provide you this secure environment that any of the organizations would really want to be in. So let's talk about the motivation, okay? Now, if you look at the security landscape, right, you'll see that there are threats that are evolving day after day. And then you'll see this is just a number from 2010 to 2019. What you could see is that the number of vulnerabilities have increased manifold. In fact, if you see, right, just over about 9 years, it's more than double. And what is more concerning is the fact that if you see the vulnerabilities that require you to have authentication versus the vulnerabilities that do not require you to have an authentication, you see the number is staggering. About somewhere around 90% of the vulnerabilities that were identified, right, did not require you to have any authentication whatsoever, which is quite concerning. And then, if you look at this, right, what you decide is that any organization needs to have very secure portfolio in trying to look and then try to have these vulnerabilities identified proactively and at the same time be able to act. But then if you look at the conventional security management practices as well, right, what you'll see that they are actually bogged down with a lot of limitations or lacunae. If you see, they're kind of reactive. If you have even 5 assets within your organization that you're using, right, what it means for you is that you will be able to have these 5 assets being looked at various different sources, find out if they are vulnerable or not. And then given that every 6 months, every quarter, you'll have updates available to these, right? What it also means is that you are actually doing a catch-up game on the updates as well. But at the same time, you're also doing a catch-up game on finding out whether the versions for each of these assets that you're using, right, are they vulnerable or not, which typically makes this a little more reactive. Again, what I said, right, if you have these different sources, right, what it means is that you'll have a lot of efforts being spent into getting to look at these fragmented sources and then be able to understand whether any of these vulnerabilities go and impact any of my assets that I'm using within my organization. And once you've identified that these are the assets that are vulnerable, right, what it also means is that I have to go figure out and apply some patches on it. Again, pretty much manual. There are a lot of improvements that have happened in the recent past, but then it's still quite manual. What this entire thing results in is that you are having a delayed application of patches, delayed identification of vulnerabilities, delayed. It's like you're always doing a catch-up game, which is not what you'd want to do when you're looking at security as a major pillar of what you would want to do for your organization. And all of this is resulting into an inefficient AIOps. It's even more concerning when we start looking at these vulnerabilities. So let's deep dive into what is known as the vulnerability management chaos. If you look at this particular picture, right, what it's trying to represent it, if you see, look at the blue circle, right, what it denotes is these could be the possible amount of vulnerabilities that are identified in the field, okay? While what you really need to work upon is just this small dot that you see. Now, how does this chaos really come into play? If you look at, again, some data points, right, you'll see from 2010 to 2019, right? The amount of vulnerabilities that are figured out, right? If you just look at 2019, right? 15,000 odd vulnerabilities, right? Amongst all of these vulnerabilities, right? If you figured out the vulnerabilities which were actually exploitable, right? It's just about 1,000, 1,500 so. Which means, right? There are a lot of vulnerabilities in the field. The moment there is a vulnerability that is introduced in the field, right, what you need to do is go look at it and try and understand how are you impacted as an organization. But at the same time, right, given that you are running behind and trying to find out whether these vulnerabilities really go impact me, right, what you also need to understand is that not every vulnerability is exploitable. And hence, many companies actually spend a lot of efforts trying to spend time and efforts on things which are less priority, which means go behind the vulnerabilities which are really not exploitable in their environment, versus having all the energies around just the red dot. And this is exactly what we are trying to address in this talk, where we're trying to let the organizations know that amongst all the vulnerabilities that you have, what is it that you really need to focus? Now, what this really results when an organization is trying to put all of these energies, right, it is going to again result into delays in trying to fix those vulnerabilities, which means a lot of financial loss, in some cases IP loss as well, and then the trust factor, because if there is a vulnerability that goes out in the field, right, you are obviously losing the trust from the general audience in the company that you've taken years to build. So that's one important factor that we are trying to address as part of this one. Now, how does this really come into play? So we are trying to, as I said, right, we are trying to look at a lot of open source utilities which can actually be stitched together to provide you an end-to-end solution around how do you really manage a vulnerability. So we are trying to stitch CSAF, as I said, it is Common Security Advisory Framework. Now, the reason the CSAF becomes very important is if you look at any of the sources which actually lists the vulnerabilities, right? If you look at NIST or if you look at any other database where we have these vulnerabilities listed, right? It's a free text, which means, right, if let's assume I'm even using 5 assets from different sources, right? What I would have to do is keep a track of these 5 assets on these websites or these sources, and then read through lengths and lengths of documentation and figure out whether any of these vulnerabilities are really impacting me. And again, as I said, right, there are many factors, many variables there. There could be different versions of the software. There could be multiple vulnerabilities in a single version of a software, which means, right, it becomes manifold. So CSAF is something which is actually providing a programmatic way of having any of your security advisories listed or are communicated in standard format. The moment you have a standardized format added as part of CSAF, right, what it becomes is that you can actually scan it programmatically and figure out what is it that you really want to do. The next in the puzzle is VEX. So we saw in the vulnerability management chaos, right, that of all the vulnerabilities that are listed, right, not every vulnerability is something that I need to figure out or worry about. And that's where VEX comes into play. What VEX tries to do is, right, if it takes the CSAF input, it tries to help look at whatever you have in your infrastructure and then be able to tell you what is it that can be exploited, what is it that cannot be exploited, which means this brings in the beauty of trying to understand the context in which these assets are being used in your infrastructure. And we're trying to have a few other utilities. We'll go look at it in the subsequent, which is the AI part of it, which we'll look in the next few slides. Now, if you look at this, right, we just spoke about CSAF. What it does is the biggest advantage that it provides is represent any of your security advisories in a standard format, which is what is starting this entire journey. And then VEX actually takes that, looks at what you have in your environment and then analyzes what is it that you could exploit and what is it that you cannot. Then comes the third part, which is Trivi. So this is an open source utility. It's kind of a scanner which can go scan your infrastructure, figure out what you have, what versions you have, and within that versions, figure out whether any of these versions are impacted or not. This context, it brings it to VEX. VEX understands that information, and basis that it then tries to work upon and then build what is known as a file which actually tells you what is the likelihood and impact of any of the vulnerabilities that are listed for your infrastructure. And the last part is the VEX LLM, which is what uses LLM to be able to look at the outputs that are given by VEX and Trivi, work on that output, and then figure out what is it that really needs your attention. Which means, right, you see this is like funneling in, okay? What is happening is, right, with a lot of data, with a lot of vulnerabilities coming in, right, it's slowly trickling down into the elements that you really need to act upon, which is what VEX LLM would do. It will tell you what is it you could safely ignore, what is it that you need to act upon, which means it is trying to remove out any noise that you would have in the outputs that have been generated so far. So this is a pictorial representation of what we just spoke about. So you can see Trivi, what it tries to do is looks at and scans the entire infrastructure that you have within your data center and tries to list down what is it that is vulnerable, what is it that is not vulnerable, or at least list down, think about it like an index into what you have in your data center, saying that, okay, this asset, this is the version that you're using, this is where you're using it. While CSAF, we discussed, right, what it is trying to do is pull in data from various sources where typically the software advisories are listed and put it into a concise, standardized format. The moment you have it in a standardized, concise format, right, this CSAF advisories are provided to VEX, and the information that Trivi pulls in from all your infrastructures, right, is being given to VEX. It tries to get the information from the advisory, get the information of what you have in your data center, and basis that, right, generates an advisory which tells you the likelihood and impact of any of the vulnerabilities that you see. This output is then provided to your VEX LLM, which goes further and tries to remove all the noises that you would have in that particular data. Yes?
So in the case of Trivi, does it use agents or is it just using basically network schema? Can you repeat the question?
So the question is that in case of Trivi, does it use any agents to be able to scan? So yes, there are a few agents that it typically uses, but those are not something which is sitting. What it does is uses the native command. So let's assume if it is trying to work with Kubernetes and trying to scan through Kubernetes, it will try to work with all the Kubernetes native commands, be able to get that information and process what all vulnerabilities are there versus what all vulnerabilities are not there. Same is the case with file systems, same is the case with OS libraries. So it deals with a lot of native utilities to get this information. So I would not say it is an agent, but it understands basic elements of, okay, if it's a SLES, what I need to use. If it's a Alpine, what I need to use. Does that help you? Okay. So once you have all the required information, the VEX LLM actually takes that output and then tries to nullify anything that you really don't need to act upon, which is what we call it as Trivi ignore files. And then you could even have it represented in a standard table format so that can again be programmatically looked at and then act upon. Now the beauty of this is nothing which is reactive. Okay, this is actually dynamic and is happening in a continuous fashion, which means let's assume you have any new images brought in, you have any new systems brought in, right? This is going to happen on a continuous basis, which means, right, you are going to try, in fact, in some cases, right, even before you go deploy, right, this is going to be tell you that, okay, whatever you're trying to deploy has got these many vulnerabilities and you need to go look at it. So that's how this makes it a lot more programmatic. And the most important thing is this is autonomous. So that's how it helps. With that, I'll hand it over to Dhruv to talk about details of how this flows.
Yeah, hey, thank you, Hemant. Hey guys, this is Dhruv. I work with NVIDIA currently. So yeah, Hemant explained it very well that we usually discover a lot of vulnerabilities, but all of them cannot be even exploited. So in order to just basically provide a short example, we have utilized this Vexelum tool, where if you'll see, we basically get all the CSAF advisories, and also depending on the what tool and what we actually really need to test, and like what vulnerabilities are there. We pull in those data, and those data basically get stored in a JSON file, and that has almost all the description of the vulnerabilities. And we use basically this OpenAI example, where we basically just basically parse in that file, and it basically generates the .trivia ignore file. So what trivia ignore files contains is basically it will just contain the things where those vulnerabilities are not exploitable. It will basically just sort of ignore the most common things, like as we have seen, right? Like in terms of percentage, 10-20% vulnerabilities are only which are exploitable, right? So ignore file will basically contain all the ones which we can just ignore safely, and post that we can actually print the table where we also have other things which can be exploitable. So yeah, if you'll see basically the generated JSON file from Vax, it basically looks like this, where here we have sort of a description where something says that, hey, this is the critical vulnerabilities, this is the high severity, this is the medium severity, and stuff like that, and we can also filter out stuff from there. And that's how our description of files will look like from the trivia basically. And if you'll see, basically it will create this trivia ignore file, where it will have this confidence and a reason, where it will tell you that, hey, this is why it affects this library, and like this is the confidence I can tell that this vulnerability is not at all exploitable, or it is exploitable, and stuff like that, based on the VexLLM tools output. And this is basically a trivia ignore file. So here you will not see the things which are really exploitable stuff, right? And then if you really want to see some high severity stuff, it will also tell us in a nice printable format version, where it will just tell you from the tool itself that, hey, these are the exploitable vulnerabilities which you might just want to look at, and you might want to just be very careful about and serious about. So as you can see that in our past example, that one of the vulnerability was like that, which was SQLite, which was a high severity, so which is not part of ignore file, and it is actually giving us that, hey, it actually severely affected. And this is mostly the last slide, where we'll be basically, these are the lot of things we can do in terms of enhancement of the security and consistency, where this tool basically helps us, or this kind of the trick can this kind of method can be help us utilize the standardized data format what CSAF has from years, and we can actually utilize that for understanding more better using the LLMs, and help us for our own environment. it can also be automated in terms of the timely method or some other CI/CD approaches ways where we can just timely and comprehensively actually explain this in a more better fashion. It can also basically improve the prioritization in terms of the our task for entire team where depending on, because now we have more understanding about like what actually we should be focused in terms of the vulnerability. It also gives us the actionable insight, which also leads us to basically better task prioritizations and also the what action we really need to take, and which basically leads to reducing overall team efforts. Yeah, and it will basically enhance our security in more automated and automated fashion as much as possible, and also give us the better idea about how to handle this. This is basically the example we explored, and these are basically some of the references we have explored from there, which are pretty good. That's basically it for our examples, and I think we can also take some questions if you guys have. Yes. Yes.
We know that the attacking community are already using tools like this. And my question to you is, what in this suite would prevent an attacker from actually doing exactly the same thing?
Yeah.
Finding that weak link, that chink in the armor, and zeroing it. So what protections exist?
Yeah. First of all, this is a great question.
Can you repeat or summarize?
Yeah, so the question is, the attackers or the hackers are always ahead of the game, which means, right, even before you have a system, right, they know how to break that system. Similarly here, right, what you see is there is a solution which actually helps you provide details about how and what you need to do in terms of vulnerabilities, how do you act upon vulnerabilities. So don't you think the attackers or the hackers can actually use this to be ahead of the game and then be able to break this? So precisely that's the question, okay? So one important factor about this particular solution is that it not only tries and suggests what you could possibly ignore, right? Even for that matter, things which are not affected. So wherever you will see that there is a vulnerability, you have that vulnerability associated with any of your systems, and if that vulnerability is something which the system says is not affecting your environment, what it also tries to do is, right, provide a detailed root cause analysis of saying, why is it that this particular vulnerability for this particular software, this particular version does not really affect you? Which means, right, there are two things that typically anybody would want to do. One is, whatever is not something which affects me, I need to understand in detail why does it affect me. That's one thing, because it should not be a case that I focus my energies on something which I feel is vulnerable and that affects me, but do not look at things which do not affect me. So that's one big advantage that this particular solution provides, trying to provide a root cause analysis of why is it that certain vulnerabilities are not affecting your environment. Secondly, right, it will also provide a detailed root cause analysis around those. Now, obviously, one more aspect is that given that this particular thing tries to understand, it's programmatic, which means, right, it becomes even more easy for the hackers now. Because earlier, right, it was something which is textual information, but now that it is programmable, right, it becomes much more easy for any attacker to be able to go and tweak with these files programmatically. Which means, right, you obviously don't need to even use brute force. You could do simple programming and you could be able to. But then, even for that matter, right, the files that are associated with it, typically your CSAF files, right, they are kind of protected in sense that you would have the CSAFs being made available at specific sources only, which means, right, you would try to piggyback on the security measures that are provided, right? So let's assume NIST, right? Obviously, there are a lot of security measures already on NIST, which means, right, if I'm having a CSAF file being posted there, right, obviously there are some security measures that I'm piggybacking on from NIST. Similarly, right, if you look at obviously the Trivi, the output that Trivi is trying to give us, right, it is trying to scan through your data centers, which means certain things are still private. Obviously, certain things are there in the public domain, which means obviously somebody is going to fiddle with those and try to do what they do best. But then certain aspects are still internal to the organization, which means what Trivi does with scanning the infrastructures, those are still private. Vex and Trivi still work within your environments, which means, right, you are still isolated from the outside network to a certain extent. So those are, I would not say those are very safe measures, but they are still, I would say, some measures that could help protect from certain things. Yeah, I understand what your concern is, surely. And OSs and a few other organizations are working towards it, but yeah, that's what we have today, at least.
So, as a follow-up, Trivi's the piece that gives me, as a security professional, is the piece that gives me the most concern. Because the rest of this, I could run external as an attacker. In fact, they probably have it from day one. All I need is a tool that basically looks at your infrastructure. And there is no such concept as inside-outside networks. If you're familiar with Zero Trust, there is no inside-outside. So they're at your door. So if Trivi is not doing, it's not retrieving information in a secure manner, authenticated access and whatnot, then, I mean, a generic network scan is a routine thing that happens today. If this is doing more than that and it's not protected, I mean, the details that's getting out, then this is I wouldn't call it a power tool for attackers because, frankly speaking, they've had more than this for quite some time.
Sure.
They were early adopters of AI in terms of
Very true.
going after systems. But what you're showing is that there's an open source solution. And what we've seen in the attacking community is somebody will bundle this so that script kiddies can do it.
Yep.
And what we've seen with IT professionals is they are slow to do anything. There's many pieces of infrastructure that have to basically be put together. The other thing that jumps out at me is this is dependent on things like the National Vulnerability Database and whatnot. So this covers no zero day because there's at least a 30-day delay before anything gets posted in the National Vulnerability Database. Because the vendors get an opportunity to respond to it, right? So you are absolutely not protecting new stuff, as you pointed out. If you bring a new system online, this is helpful. But frankly, once you run it through your infrastructure, what you're looking for is the new postings. You know, do I have that? But you are way behind where the attacker community is. I guess it's an interesting, there's a whole bunch of commercial stuff that's basically doing this. This is a free version, it looks like. But the level of protection it's going to give you is so-so. Now that said,
They probably give a chance to sort of repeat, summarize.
So I'll try to summarize the question. So again, the hackers are much more ahead in terms of specifically on this side, right? If you look at zero-day vulnerabilities, right? Obviously, if you're looking at any standard like NIST, right? Obviously, you are lagging because there the vulnerabilities get listed much later. But then, if you look at that, right, CSAF is made such that it can pull information from various sources, which means we've listed just a few sources. But then, if there are any other sources that are available, CSAF can actually hook onto it and provide that information. Again, obviously when there are vulnerabilities that are listed, right? Not every vulnerability. So there is a, let's assume there is a life cycle or a state machine to a vulnerability, obviously, which means, right, on day 0, right, the vulnerability is still going to be not fixed in many cases, which obviously means, right, throughout the entire life cycle, right, CSAF can actually be able to trace right from day 0. It's just that you'll have to have, and it could actually hook into any of the sources. We've just listed a few. So that way, right, you are still having information for day 0 vulnerabilities as part of the CSAF. So that's taken care. But I understand the other aspect as well, where you said, right, there are many things which needs to be a little secure. In case of Privy, you mentioned that, yeah, it's a scanner that is available, which means if you get a free hand, right, you could go and scan the entire infrastructure, which obviously, given that it's a scanning tool, it's a network scanning tool, obviously, which means, right, you could, there are certain aspects to Trivy as well, which means, right, you could have certain aspects provided autonomous, which means you go freely scan this particular infrastructure, versus certain things that you could actually have some manual control as well, saying that this infrastructure you go scan on a regular basis, this infrastructure you scan only when I demand. So there are buttons and knobs that you could use within Trivy to be able to have certain level of I would say access control exercise on top of Trivia, how it goes and scans. So that is something which is obviously available with Trivia as well.
I think you're assuming that the bad guys don't have their own copy of Trivia. They're not going to use your version. They're going to use their version.
Yeah.
So they're going to land in your infrastructure, install the tool they want to use, and scan. They're not going to leverage what you've got because they've got their own infrastructure. So scanning tools, the history of them, we on the good guy side have basically co-opted the bad guys' tools and built upon them. And every time they've expanded, we co-opt what they did. So when I see something like Trivy, it's like, okay, here we go again, another, going back to Nessus and all the tools that have been around for a long time. This is just another one of those. All that said, many of the breaches that we see today are because of stupid lack of patching and updates. And I do work with the legal community. If you were running this kind of infrastructure and then you weren't patching, and a lawyer got a hold of you, God help you.
Yeah. No, that's true. That's true. See, I work for Dell. He works for NVIDIA. And obviously, the first thing that you would do, right, whenever somebody is calling up, we would ensure that the person or the customer is on the latest and greatest. That's just to help protect them from all possible vulnerabilities. But then you need to look at this a little differently as well, because what we said is, right, this is not something which you are actually trying where it's not reactive, which means, right, if let's assume I'm going to use a particular image in my infrastructure, right, what I'm trying to do is make sure that image once, before it gets deployed on a massive scale, right, that image is being scanned, which means, right, now that I have scanned it, right, it can go get deployed. Obviously, there'll be versions of it which will check. But then, yeah, to your point, right, if somebody gets access to it, that is something that we obviously cannot really ensure. But then there are measures in place where you would have certain aspects of your, even within your data centers, right, you would still have your dev test and production being looked at differently from a security posture perspective also. Very similar to that, this is how Trivy would also function. Yes? Yeah, so we've not used this
repeat the question?
Yeah. So how effective, the question was how effective are these utilities or tools within your infrastructure if you've used it in the past? So we've not used it at a full-fledged level, at least on our infrastructures. But then at least from what we've realized, the way we work today, right, in terms of a lot of infrastructures being deployed, and there being a life cycle to those infrastructures as well with typical OS patches, with typical system patches, firmware patches, or for that matter, the infrastructures that we're using in terms of having so Kubernetes clusters being deployed, right? I feel this solution covers a lot of spectrum that ways. Typically, right, when you associate yourself with some specific tool, right, it'll cover just a narrow spectrum, but then this actually covers a broad spectrum. Hence, we feel this could be much more useful for the organizations, given that you could, as I said, right, you could actually make sure it runs in on autonomous mode as well, where it keeps a track of things as and when they're happening. So we feel from that perspective, this at least from what we've investigated, this is, I think, quite good for being an open source.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I was gonna, what's the complexity level in terms of installing this suite? You know, so for example, a developer community, you know, is this something that would be fairly straightforward to set up so that a lab can basically use it?
Yes.
Can you comment on that?
Yes. So the question is, from a developer's perspective, how complex or how easy is this to be set up? Now, I'll answer the question a little differently. So if you look at and try to understand the formats itself, if you look at a CSAF file, right, obviously if you look at it from a manual or a human perspective, it is going to be a little difficult for you to understand, given that you might have n number of softwares with different versions, right, or different vulnerabilities within your infrastructure. But then, if you look at the overall solution and put it together, right, I would not say it will take you just a couple of hours for you to get running with this. That should be it. But then if you look at the individual pieces, trying understanding what the output is, how does it really correlate with the next input, right? That is going to take some time. There's obviously going to be some learning curve associated, but then the end result that you get, right, pretty much tells you what and how, which means what vulnerabilities are there and how are they impacting you. Which means if you just look at it as a black box, just install what is needed, right? I think it is going to be just a couple of hours. But then if you want to understand the nuances of each of those formats, how do these formats interlock within each other to give you the end result, that learning curve could be a little more. Yes, sir.
It's been a long time since I've looked at the vulnerability database, but does that also provide information on specific patches you need to install to fix that? So that would also be an output of this.
Yes.
As is.
Yes. So the question is, I'll just repeat further. So the question is, given that I've not looked at the vulnerability database for quite some time, right? Does the vulnerability database also provide what patches would go fix or remediate the vulnerability? So yes, there are information around this which tells you exactly what version is vulnerable, what version is not vulnerable, how do you move from the vulnerable to the non-vulnerable side. So there are details around that as well. So yes, that's a side effect, or I would say that's a side benefit of this overall solution. You would also get to have what patches need to go in for the things that are shown with a very high confidence, saying that these are the impacted ones you have to go remediate. So yes. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Sorry. So some of this work has been, obviously, CSAF has been developed by OASIS. Do you know if that work has been done in conjunction with STICs and TAXI and sidewalks, which are threat intel kinds of protocols? Are you familiar with those?
I'm sorry. So the question is CSAF developed in conjunction with a few other standards, and then I couldn't get those standards.
OASIS, STICs, TAXI, and sidewalks, which are threat intelligence protocols that OASIS developed probably before they did this.
Okay. At least in my reading, I've not realized that there is anything that is happening in conjunction with taxi text. In fact, there have been multiple iterations of this. CSAF itself, VEX itself, there are a few other parallels, but then this happens to be much more evolved from the OSIS stable itself. Any other questions do we have? Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you.